Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have been invited to address such a distinguished group of leaders from the wide range of philanthropic organizations, as well as governments and businesses that work closely with them. I'd first of all like to congratulate Susan Phillips and Carleton University for taking the initiative to launch a master's degree in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. This degree will help create and train new leaders in the not-for-profit sector. It will help make these organizations operate more creatively, efficiently, and effectively. Carleton's initiative reflects the growing recognition that the management of not-profit organizations is measurably different from purely commercial enterprises. This morning's roundtable provides us with a great opportunity to discuss both the challenges and the opportunities facing our not-for-profit sector across Canada. Now, Susan asked me to confine my remarks to 15 minutes, and this is going to be a real challenge for me because my partners say that Don Johnson has difficulty saying hello in less than 5 minutes. Now, my involvement in the not-for-profit sector has been focused on assisting charities to access additional funding from the private sector. I'll outline the vital role which donations from individuals, corporations, and foundations play in supplementing direct government funding. I will then discuss the new fiscal challenges facing our not-for-profit sector and the opportunity for the federal government to help our charities address these challenges. Now, understandably, all three levels of government which provide funding for the not-for-profit sector must distribute their financial support equitably across the geographic regions which they represent. The federal government provides financial support to charities across the entire country, the provincial governments to charities across each of the provinces, and municipal governments to charities across cities, towns, and villages. Now, because of the need for the government to provide equitable funding across these geographic areas, it is difficult for the government to concentrate their financial support on selected not-for-profit organizations to enable them to become world-class institutions. Now, this is where the private sector funding plays a crucial role in helping specific charitable organizations to grow from being good to being great. Now, in order for our hospitals, universities, research institutes, social service agencies, and arts and cultural organizations to attract the best and the brightest talent, it is essential for them to receive sufficient funding to provide competitive compensation, research support, cutting-edge equipment, and infrastructure. Private sector donations often provide this crucial incremental funding, making these institutions the best not only in Canada, but also internationally. Now, given today's economic, fiscal, and political uncertainties, both domestically and particularly internationally, our nonprofit sector is facing significant challenges. All three levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, play an important role in providing funding for vital services for all Canadians. That includes health care, education, social services, and arts and culture. And as Susan mentioned, as our population ages, the demand for these services continues to grow, especially for health care. All three levels of government, however, are currently facing fiscal challenges themselves, the most important being to reduce and ultimately eliminate their fiscal deficits. Now, it is unlikely that they will increase taxes. The major way to reduce deficits is by spending cuts and restraint. There are limits to what governments can do during these uncertain fiscal and economic times. This raises the question, what can the government do to help our charitable sector address these challenges? Now, let's go back to the mid-90s. Both governments and charities faced similar challenges in the 1990s. For the federal government, it was to reduce and then eliminate the fiscal deficit. It did so primarily through dramatic spending cuts. To replace these cuts in funding to charitable organizations, a way had to be found to provide the private sector with an incentive to increase their donations. These incentives, however, would need to be tax effective from the government's perspective in order for them to be politically acceptable. Now, in Canada at that time, if someone donated shares to a registered charity, the donor would receive a charitable donation tax receipt for the market value of the gift, but the donor was deemed to have sold the shares when they were transferred to the charity. The donor therefore had to pay a capital gains tax on his gift. Now, this tax offset a significant portion of the charitable donation tax receipt, and virtually no one gave stock to charities in Canada at that time. However, in the United States, donors of shares were exempt from any capital gains tax on their gift. So back in 1995, we commenced an advocacy campaign to convince the federal government to remove this barrier to charitable giving and unlock private wealth for public good. Now, in his 1997 budget, Finance Minister Paul Martin, with the support of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, cut the capital gains tax in half on gifts of listed securities on a 5-year trial basis. The government wanted confirmation that this measure would not only benefit major hospitals and universities, but also a broad range of smaller charities that provided social services to people in need, as well as smaller arts and cultural organizations. 5 years later, in 2002, this measure met the test and was made permanent. Our advocacy campaign for the complete elimination of the capital gains tax on gifts of shares continued each year following the 1997 budget. Finally, in the 2006 budget, Finance Minister Jim Flaherty, with the support of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, removed the remaining capital gains tax on gifts of listed securities. Now, these measures have been an enormous success. Beginning from a base of virtually zero, charities have been receiving more than $1 billion in donations of listed securities every year since the 2006 budget. Now, while a small portion of these gifts would be substitutions for cash donations, a major portion of these gifts were incremental, donations that would not have happened without this amendment to the Income Tax Act. Many philanthropists are capable of making multi-million-dollar donations in the form of listed securities, but do not have the cash resources to make such significant gifts. What about the future? After examining all of the alternatives for the government to provide additional tax incentives for charitable donations from the private sector, we concluded that the single most effective step which the government can take is to expand the capital gains tax exemption that currently applies to gifts of stock to include gifts of private company shares and real estate. Removal of this charitable barrier to giving would unlock more private wealth for public good. In the United States, gifts of private company shares and real estate account for approximately 20% of total gifts of appreciated capital property, and 80% is accounted for by listed securities. Using the U.S. experience as an example, it is reasonable to assume that removal of the capital gains tax on private company shares and real estate would result in approximately $200 million of an incremental funding to charities in Canada. Now, we had to address certain concerns in our proposals. We proposed that the amendment to the Income Tax Act would include a restriction that the charity could not issue a tax receipt to the donor until the charity had received the cash proceeds from the sale of the asset. This establishes the real value of the donation and addresses the concern about valuation abuse. Furthermore, if the purchaser of the asset is not at arm's length from the donor, then the charity, not the donor, would have to obtain 2 independent professional appraisals of the asset in order to confirm that the charity was receiving fair market value for the gift. If the gift, however, was in the form of property that the charity would be using to fulfill its mission, such as a gift of land to a university or a hospital, and the charity was not planning on monetizing the gift, the charitable donation tax credit would be based upon the value provided by 2 professional appraisals retained by the charity. Now, back in March of 2001, the C.D. Howe Institute hosted a conference on strengthening charity finance in Canada. The head of philanthropic services at one of Canada's leading financial institutions made a presentation at the conference. He estimated that if these measures were introduced, charities would receive donations of $170 to $225 million per annum in gifts of private company shares in real estate. Importantly, he also estimated that the two measures would cost the federal government only $50 to $65 million per annum. Obviously, the benefits of increased funding to charities would far outweigh the fiscal cost to the federal government of implementing these measures in the next budget. Now, from the perspective of mayors and councilors of our cities, towns, and villages, these measures would provide additional private sector funding for charities in each of their local municipalities. And the fiscal cost would be borne by the federal and provincial governments, not the municipalities, because municipalities derive their tax revenues primarily from property taxes, not income taxes. So logically, members of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities should also be supportive of these proposals. Now let's talk about this concern about substitution for cash donations. Charitable donations of these two appreciated capital assets would be largely incremental, not substitutions for cash donations. Prospective donors of private company shares in real estate would have the opportunity to make significant donations at a time when they plan to sell their business or the real estate. If they're required to pay a capital gains tax on their gift of appreciated capital property, they would not be inclined to give a portion of the asset to a charity at the time of the sale. Presumably, if they were exempt from capital gains taxes on such gifts, many would give serious consideration to making a significant charitable donation to a favored cause. I'll give you one specific example. A good friend of mine has a minority interest in a private company, and the company has no plans to go public. He's been an investor in this company for about 20 years. Now, he has a purchase and sale agreement between himself and the controlling shareholder of the company, so he can sell his shares at any time to the controlling shareholder based upon a formula, a multiple of the company's cash flow. Now, he has committed to me that if the capital gains tax on private company shares is removed in the upcoming budget, he will donate $5 million to his alma mater and $1 million to a vision campaign which I'm chairing for an eye center at the Toronto Western Hospital. He would simply donate his shares to these two charitable organizations. They would monetize these shares immediately by selling them to the controlling shareholder based upon his purchase and sale agreement. The charity would receive the cash proceeds and provide him with a charitable donation tax receipt. However, if the capital gains tax on such gifts is not removed, he will simply continue with the status quo and retain his investment in the private company, so the charities will not receive this $6 million gift. A similar opportunity to access additional major donations would arise when the owner of a private business decides to retire and sell their business. Now, under the current tax system, if you're an entrepreneur and you take your company public and subsequently donate shares in your public company to a registered charity, you receive a charitable donation tax receipt for the market value of your gift and are completely exempt from any capital gains tax. However, under the current tax system, if you're an entrepreneur and you decide to keep your company private, if you donate your shares to a charity, you're required to pay a capital gains tax on your gift of shares. Our proposal would remove this inequity and would level the playing field for all entrepreneurs in Canada who have an interest in giving back to the communities which have played an important role in their success. Now, there are 107,000 members of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, CFIB. The members are all private companies or organizations. Logically, the vast majority of CFIB's members would be supportive of our proposal. Many of CFIB members are located in rural communities, and not-for-profit organizations in their local communities would benefit from their generosity. Now, in his June 2011 budget statement, Finance Minister Jim Flaherty announced that the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance would conduct hearings on tax incentives for charitable donations. The committee began its hearings in January of this year, but unfortunately did not have time to complete the hearings before the House recessed for the summer back in June. The remaining hearings will be held after the House returns on September the 17th, next Monday. Hopefully, these hearings will be completed by October, and the committee will issue its report with recommendations to the House of Commons by late October or early November, so they can be given consideration in the next budget. We are optimistic that the committee will include our two proposals in its report. In conclusion, in light of these developments, it would be especially timely if each of you would communicate your support for these measures to your local member of Parliament and other relevant politicians and bureaucrats. If the government were to react promptly, the first graduates of Carleton University's new master's program would have even more challenges and even more opportunities. Thank you.